When Russia rolled its tanks into Ukraine, Belarus's strongman, Alexander Lukashenko, jumped in line behind Putin without hesitation. He figured it was the smart move: back Russia, win fast, and cash in on being Moscow's only loyal sidekick. But things didn't go according to script. Instead of a quick victory, the war has dragged on, grinding down not just Ukraine, but Belarus too. What Lukashenko thought would bring him power and rewards has instead left his country tangled up in Russia's mess, closer than ever to losing its own independence. This is especially striking because Lukashenko has always prided himself on being a master survivor. For decades, he played both sides, cozying up to Russia when it helped him, while tossing just enough promises of reform to the West to keep them from completely turning their backs. It was a balancing act that made Belarus look neutral on the world stage, at least before 2022. That all changed when he sided with Putin. Belarus opened its territory for Russian troops to storm into Ukraine, and reports later revealed that it even got wrapped up in Russia's darker war tactics, like the forced relocation of Ukrainian children. On top of that, Lukashenko broke a long-held pledge by letting Moscow stash nuclear weapons inside Belarus. Why take such risks? Because, like Putin, he assumed Ukraine wouldn't hold out for long. He gambled that the country would fold quickly, and once it did, Belarus would stand to gain from proving its loyalty. But Ukraine refused to break, and Belarus found itself paying the price. The deeper Belarus tied itself to Russia, the more it suffered when sanctions hit. By late 2022, Belarus's economy had shrunk nearly 5%, a sharp blow driven by the same penalties squeezing Moscow. The economies of the two countries, once separate, started to sink in tandem. Russia's economy stumbled hard after the Ukraine invasion. According to Statista, its GDP shrank month after month for an entire year, March 2022 through March 2023. The worst dip hit in June 2022, when the economy dropped by more than 5%. And because Belarus had hitched itself so tightly to Russia's war machine, every bump in Moscow's road spilled over into Minsk. The first year of the war rattled Belarus, but then came an unexpected turn. By 2023, the slide reversed. Russia needed weapons, and Belarus stepped in as supplier. Factories shifted gears to churn out military gear, and Russian money started pouring across the border to keep the pipeline open. That lifeline brought Belarus back from the brink. Its economy bounced up by about 4% in both 2023 and 2024. On the surface, it looked like good news for Lukashenko, but the price was steep. Belarus's economy began to look less like a modern, independent system and more like something ripped from the old Soviet playbook, fully geared toward Moscow's needs, not its own people's. For Putin, this was ideal, a loyal neighbor feeding his war effort. For Lukashenko, it became a trap. The more Belarus depended on Russia, the more it bled its own strength. Moscow's endless demands dug deep into the country's economy and into its independence. One of the clearest and strangest signs of this collapse popped up in the most ordinary place: the kitchen. In spring 2025, Politico reported that Belarus was suddenly short on potatoes, a staple so central to the national diet that locals call it their second bread. How did a potato-loving country run short of potatoes? Lukashenko's heavy-handed policies had something to do with it. He slapped strict price controls on the crop, even encouraging citizens to snitch on shopkeepers who ignored the rules. The message was clear: keep potatoes cheap at all costs. Farmers, of course, weren't thrilled. If growing potatoes wasn't worth the effort, they'd just grow something else. And that's exactly what happened. Harvest numbers plummeted in 2024, down nearly 1 million tons from the year before. Shelves emptied, and the cracks in Lukashenko's iron grip began to show. By August, reports surfaced of him lashing out in a cabinet meeting earlier that year. He ranted about why there weren't enough potatoes, shouting questions like, "Why can't we grow them, store them, and sell them properly?" He even dragged in a random farmer from Alexandria as an example, furious that others hadn't followed his lead in building storage facilities. The outburst sounded less like a confident president and more like a cornered man realizing he was losing control. And lurking in the background, of course, was Putin. ready to swoop in and claim even more influence if Belarus faltered. Meanwhile, the average Belarusian was left to deal with the fallout. Between January and March 2025, potato prices alone rose 10%. That would be bad enough on its own, but Lukashenko was also demanding farmers grow enough to feed both Belarus and Russia, pushing the country closer to a Soviet-style farm system that doesn't actually exist anymore. And the shortages didn't stop there. Inflation was running hot, workers were increasingly scarce, and costs kept climbing. GDP growth slowed to about 2% in early 2025, still better than pre-war times, but not enough to ease the sting. Food prices jumped by more than 10%. Transport costs soared too, making it pricier to move goods around the country. For ordinary families, that meant groceries, bus rides, and everyday essentials became heavier burdens. Sanctions piled on more pain, further squeezing the economy that Lukashenko had willingly chained to Putin's. Even the job market looked shaky. By the end of August, open positions had dropped to under 200,000, signaling fewer opportunities and a workforce under pressure. Belarus is running out of people to keep its war-fueled machine running. Factories are humming, jobs are open, but there simply aren't enough workers to fill them. Lukashenko may have banked on strong growth for 2025. Forecasts once predicted 4.1%, but reality is refusing to play along. Euromaidan Press laid out a bleak snapshot. Farming output has crashed by more than 8%, likely tied to that potato disaster. Trade numbers are even uglier. Exports to Russia, which make up the lifeblood of Belarus's economy, have fallen by a staggering 70%. For a country where 6 out of every 10 trade deals depend on Moscow, that collapse is devastating. The gamble Lukashenko made is clearer than ever. He shoved all his chips onto Putin's square, and now Russia is pocketing the winnings. Nowhere is this more obvious than in Belarus's unfolding oil crisis. In mid-August, Ukraine launched a series of drone strikes on the Druzhba pipeline, a giant oil artery that ferries Russian crude into Europe with a northern branch supplying Belarus's refineries. The attacks shut down that flow, and Belarus suddenly found itself with empty tanks and idle refineries. The fallout was immediate. Fuel prices shot up 8% almost overnight. Long lines formed at gas stations. Farmers, already struggling to make ends meet, couldn't get enough diesel for their tractors. The timing couldn't have been worse. Lukashenko tried to play the role of calm leader, insisting it would all blow over. Surely, he thought, Russia would step in and bail Belarus out. After all, his country had bent over backwards for Putin since the start of the Ukraine invasion. But Putin doesn't deal in loyalty. He deals in self-interest. Instead of helping, he ordered Russian oil companies to swoop in and buy up Belarus's fuel stockpiles for themselves. Why? Because Ukraine's drones were hammering Russia's own refineries too. Moscow was scrambling for supply, and Belarus's crisis was just another chance for Putin to grab what he wanted. Belarus's refineries were left in a cruel bind. They needed more crude to make more fuel, but the Russian oil they depended on was being squeezed tighter and tighter. By late August, the cracks in Belarus's loyalty to Moscow finally began to show. According to Ukraineform, the government in Minsk was forced to cut back fuel shipments to Russia. On paper, this was practical. Belarus had to guarantee its own people the roughly 2 million tons of gasoline they use each year. And on the business side, it made more sense to sell to buyers like China and India, who were willing to pay better prices than Russia ever would. To an outsider, this might look like a rare moment of defiance, Belarus pushing back against its larger neighbor. But what mattered more wasn't the restriction itself. It was what Russia's behavior revealed. When Belarus needed support most, Moscow chose itself first. For ordinary Belarusians, this felt like a stab in the back.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
The betrayal showed just how dangerous Lukashenko's gamble had been. By tying his country's fate so closely to Putin, he left Belarus trapped. The economy is fraying, the political system is suffocating, and the country is sliding toward losing the one thing Moscow doesn't yet fully control: its sovereignty. Warnings about this have been circulating for years. Back in January 2025, Al Jazeera raised alarms that Belarus could one day disappear into the Russian Federation altogether. The reasoning was simple. Lukashenko's authoritarian system only works because Putin props it up. Without Russian money, troops, and political cover, his grip on power might not survive. This isn't exactly new. As far back as the late 1990s, Lukashenko floated the idea of reintegration with Russia, dreaming of a kind of Soviet revival. That wish bought him favors from Moscow for decades. But now, what once gave Belarus leverage has twisted into a trap. The union Lukashenko wanted has become a rope around his country's neck, and Putin holds the other end. Analysts have been warning about this shift for some time. Chatham House's Belarus Initiative Director, Dr. Reinhard Ostapenya, wrote in 2023 that Lukashenko's policies strengthened his own rule while hollowing out Belarus itself. Military integration is the clearest example. It's now so deep that Russian troops on Belarusian soil are treated as routine, almost invisible. That leaves Minsk in no position to push back if Putin decides, once again, to launch attacks on Ukraine from Belarusian territory. Former UK military intelligence officer Philip Ingram made this point in a September 16 interview with Times Radio. By formalizing Russia's military presence inside Belarus, Lukashenko may have set the stage for his own downfall. And then came Zapad 2025. The latest joint war exercise meant to show off Belarusian-Russian unity. On the surface, it was smaller than usual. 10,000 Belarusian soldiers paired with about 4,000 Russians, far fewer than in past drills. But that's exactly what makes it unsettling. Instead of being a flashy show of strength against NATO, the reduced scale suggested a different purpose. Putin may not have been flexing outward. He may have been sending quiet signals inward, messages for Lukashenko, for Belarus, and for anyone watching how close Minsk has drifted into Moscow's orbit. For Ukraine, the takeaway from Zapad 2025 was blunt. Russia had used Belarusian soil to launch an invasion once, and it could easily do so again. But for Belarus, the signal carried a darker meaning. As Philip Ingram explained, the drills weren't just about joint training. They normalized Russian boots on Belarusian ground. The more often Russian soldiers are stationed there, the more natural it feels, until one day, their presence is permanent. It's an invasion by stealth, disguised as friendship, cloaked in the language of alliance. And this isn't some new phenomenon. Russia has been weaving its military into Belarus's fabric for decades. Back in February 2000, just as Putin was beginning his long rule, Belarus proudly announced it was now covered by Russia's nuclear umbrella. That was the first domino. From there came years of integration, regular Zapad war games, the use of Belarus as a staging ground for the 2022 invasion, and now Putin's August 2025 boast that Moscow would park its shiny new hypersonic Zircon missiles inside Belarus. To Lukashenko, this might look like protection. To Putin, it's ownership. And if Ingram is right, it's only a matter of time before Belarus is absorbed into Russia outright. But here's the twist. That wasn't quite the future Lukashenko envisioned. He worked for years to tie Belarus tightly to Moscow, yes, but mostly as a way to shore up his own grip on power. He wanted Russia as a crutch, not as a master. He's not Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen warlord who openly governs as Putin's loyal henchman. As researcher Anastasia Stognay told the Financial Times, the idea that Lukashenko has no sovereignty at all is a myth. His wiggle room has expanded and shrunk over the years. In 2020, after mass protests, it nearly vanished. But he has always tried to stretch it again. In his mind, Russia was supposed to be a tool, not a leash. That balancing act, leaning on Moscow while still dangling the idea of reform to the West, collapsed in 2022 when he let Belarus be used in the invasion of Ukraine. The West wrote him off, and Putin tightened his grip. Now, 2 years later, Lukashenko is scrambling to claw some space back. His move to limit refined oil sales to Russia is part of that attempt. So too is a subtle shift in Belarus's mood. According to the Financial Times, by the summer of 2025, Lukashenko was once again flirting with the idea of dealing with the West, a dangerous game that risks angering the one man he can't afford to alienate. By mid-2025, whispers of change were floating through Minsk. Lukashenko, once thought to be glued to Putin's side, began testing the waters with the very people he'd spent years alienating, the West. It wasn't a dramatic pivot. No flashy speeches, no sudden policy overhauls. Instead, it was small gestures, careful signals, the kind a seasoned survivor like Lukashenko has perfected over decades. The oil restriction was one of them, a move that gave him leverage against Moscow while hinting at independence. Western diplomats, long frozen out, suddenly found him more approachable. But this shift carried a heavy risk. Putin doesn't tolerate fence-sitting, not anymore. For Moscow, Belarus isn't a partner, it's territory. The presence of Russian troops, the missiles on Belarusian soil, the economic lifeline funneled from Moscow to Minsk, all of it means Putin sees Belarus as an extension of his own empire. And any sign of Lukashenko cozying up to the West is bound to set off alarm bells in the Kremlin. The tension is now palpable. Belarus's economy is strained, its people frustrated, its sovereignty hanging by a thread. Lukashenko is gambling again, trying to play both sides, just like he did before 2022. But this time, the stakes are much higher. If he leans too far west, he risks Putin's wrath. If he leans too far east, Belarus edges closer to being swallowed whole. Every move he makes now feels like walking a tightrope with no net below. One misstep could topple not just his presidency, but Belarus itself. Lukashenko has started floating something unthinkable just a year ago: the release of Belarusian political prisoners. For years, he kept opposition leaders locked away, silencing voices that dared to challenge his rule. Now, suddenly, he's considering letting some of them walk free. Why? To buy himself a little mercy from the West. Sanctions relief, maybe. A bargaining chip he can put on the table when asking to be let back into the fold. After half a decade of being iced out, he's desperate to show he's willing to deal. But desperation drips through every move. The oil crisis stripped away any illusions of partnership with Moscow. It revealed the cold truth. Putin doesn't see Belarus as an ally, only as a tool. When Belarus ran dry, Russia bled it further. The mask was ripped off, and Lukashenko saw that his country wasn't standing beside Russia, it was kneeling beneath it. That leaves him with a nightmare. His economy is unraveling, his sovereignty is eroding, and his own power is slipping through his fingers. Exactly as Putin intended. The strongman in Minsk realizes he's trapped inside a cage he helped build. So now he's edging back onto the tightrope, wobbling between East and West. The big question, is it already too late? Can Lukashenko rebuild trust with the West fast enough to offset his dependence on Russia? Or is Belarus doomed to collapse into Moscow's grasp? And maybe Putin already senses the drift. Perhaps he knows Lukashenko is trying to wriggle free. Because while Belarus grows shaky, Putin is busy searching for new lifelines elsewhere. One of them is Turkey, another master of walking the geopolitical tightrope. Reports say Putin has been leaning hard on Ankara, begging for the air defense systems his war machine desperately needs. Turkey, a country that, like Belarus, has spent years dancing between East and West, never fully breaking from NATO, but never quite shutting the door on Moscow either. For Putin, Ankara is a tempting lifeline. His air defenses are strained, battered by Ukraine's drones and long-range missiles. Factories in Russia are running hot, but they can't churn out new systems fast enough. That's where Turkey comes in. Its defense industry is advanced, its technology respected, and its president Recep Tayyip Erdogan has made a career out of playing both sides. Already, Turkey has supplied Ukraine with Bayraktar drones, weapons that carved deep holes into Russia's armored columns early in the war. But Erdogan has also struck deals with Moscow, buying Russian S-400 missiles in defiance of his NATO allies. He hosted Putin in Ankara, shook his hand, smiled for the cameras, and then turned around to assure the West that Turkey is still firmly on its side. Now, as Russia scrambles to plug the gaps in its defenses, Putin is knocking again. He's pressuring Turkey to deliver what he can't get elsewhere: If Erdogan says yes, it could tilt the battlefield. If he says no, it would mark another fracture in Moscow's crumbling network of allies. And here's where the suspense builds. Erdogan thrives in the gray zone. He doesn't like being cornered, and he knows both sides, NATO and Russia, are watching closely. To NATO, any deal with Moscow would look like betrayal. To Russia, a rejection would look like disloyalty. So what will Turkey do? Will it throw Putin a lifeline, risking NATO's fury? Or will Erdogan pull back, leaving Russia more isolated than ever?